It'll give us a notification. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event with author Anushka Jasraj in conversation with Somak Ghoshal about her collection of short stories, Principles of Prediction. I'm Nirika. I'm from Team Champaka. I'll just introduce the speakers, the book, and Champaka bookstore to you. Anushka Jasraj is a fiction writer based in Mumbai. She holds a BFA in film production from NYU and an MFA in creative writing from the New Writers Project at the University of Texas at Austin. She was a 2015 to 16 fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown and was a regional winner of the Commonwealth Short Story Prize for Asia in both 2012 and 2017. Her work has been published in Granta, and Principles of Prediction is her first book. Somak Ghoshal is a journalist based in Bangalore. Among other things, he edits the book section of Mint Lounge. Champaka is an independent women-run bookstore, children's library, and cafe. We bring diverse stories and perspectives for our readers and through our events and in our children's library and in our books. We have an online store that ships across India where you can find all the books on our shelves, including Principles of Prediction. About the book, Principles of Prediction is a collection of short stories that draws us into the lives of sisters and friends, parents and daughters, men and women, in relationships that casually shrug off easy definition. There is tenderness here and bewilderment as well as reconciliation, as characters strip themselves bare to show us their most intimate fears and fantasies. You can get yourself a copy on our website, www.champaka.in. And now I'll hand the conversation over to Somak and Anushka.
Thank you, Nirika, for the very kind introduction. It's a great privilege and honor for me to talk to Anushka Jasraj and a collection of stories. Primarily because I'm a big fan of the short story, and in India, at least, we don't see enough short story collections coming out. So I'm also very thankful to Context Westland for publishing this volume. Nirika has already given us a sense of the stories, and I must add that there is really no point in summarizing or talking about the plots of these stories too much, because the discovery of the meaning of the stories, which are not very obvious, of course, and rather intriguing, is one of the pleasures of this volume for me. So before I begin the conversation about the book proper, I just want to ask Anushka, how does it feel to be able to publish a volume of stories which are not ostensibly linked? Because that's the publishing gambit, right? Like you have to have a collection of linked stories.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I've been following some of your reviews of short story collections. And it's been curious also to see how, people approach them as collections. There seems to be this expectation that you're supposed to finish a book all the way through, which is maybe one of the struggles with having all of these stories together, since they're so different that, I think if you just read one story or two and you don't actually complete every single story in the book, you still get a sense of a world that's been created in that one story. And partly because they were written at such different points in time, like Radio Story is one of the earliest stories that was written back in 2011. And then a couple of the stories were written right in 2019 or so. So it's also strange to have something that was written at such different points in time all collected together and then presented to a reader as one cohesive thing. But yeah, it's it also feels nice. It's satisfying to kind of have that journey completed as a book in a way.
Right. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the world building aspect of it, because no matter when the stories were written, how far apart in time, a reader will obviously see some kind of voice running through it, which kind of unites them together. And to me, it's the voice of ruggedness, there's a kind of jagged, rugged voice, and not very interested in neatness. It's interested in fragments. It's interested in creating sensations and emotions rather than whole truths and information that a conventional novel or a conventional short story would give you. I wonder whether this was something premeditated or something that naturally comes to you as a writer to write in this manner.
I think it did come naturally to me. So originally, I went into my undergraduate degree in film thinking that I'll write screenplays. But a lot of times, the same story that I would bring to a screenwriting class would not be as successful as it was in a creative writing workshop where people are interested in language, they're interested in innovating with form, like on the page. While in a screenwriting workshop, people are like, this is all unnecessary. Like, why do you need this here? So I think earlier on, it was about finding the right form for whatever, creative instincts I had. And so I was kind of lucky to figure out early on that this fits better as something that's on the page. Although it wasn't that conscious, but I was maybe just lucky to find readers who appreciated what I was trying to do and helped me clarify that, as opposed to trying to box me in and say you should have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right. I want to come back to your film writing and film experience a little later, but I wanted to ask you, how did you escape the temptation of writing a novel? Because that's what everybody wants to do, and that's a sure shot way of getting published, whether here or abroad.
Yeah, so I am writing a novel. So,
Right.
I hope my short story readers won't feel betrayed when I suddenly come out with a novel. But it's actually the novel itself has been ongoing, like alongside short stories. It's been more that the short story form is a temptation where it can be really fun to just start something new, manage to complete it in a short period of time. It's less commitment almost. It can, you can do a lot more. Like you can be more experimental in the short story because the stakes in terms of your time commitment are lower. So all
Right.
of those things kind of play into it. But I think so. As I've been writing the novel, it has actually helped me to approach it as a series of short stories, in that I see each chapter as a short story. So those skills come into it, and there's just a lot more carefulness in terms of developing the characters and making sure that things that are set up early on in the plot are then delivered on later, which I think the short story can get away with sometimes, being a little more reckless in terms of
And
just
elusive, I suppose. I'll come to the elusive and the intriguing parts of your stories, but I wonder if you want to read something like a short passage, maybe just to give a flavor of, one of the stories to the
yeah.
listener.
So I'll read from a short story called Numerology. When I was 8, my parents took me to an astrologer who translated my name into numbers and wrote down 7 things on a sheet of paper, which my mother sealed in a light blue envelope to be opened and read on my 13th birthday. I turned 13 last year, but my mother died a week before the day I was to read the contents of that envelope. It remains unopened where my mother placed it, between pages 16 and 17 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Sometimes I open the book and hold the envelope up to the light, but it is unusually opaque. I'll open it on my next birthday because it would be inauspicious to do so any sooner. I read and reread pages 16 and 17, searching for some hint of my mother, a secret code, but all I find is a scene about Alice shrinking and imagining herself as a telescope. For a while, I resented Rani for dying so near my birthday, as though it had been a choice. She could have waited, I thought. She could have let me have my party and then scolded me for having my friends over past midnight, and then felt guilty and taken me out for Sitafal milkshakes from Apsara Ice Cream Parlor. Instead, I spent my birthday with Meena Auntie, my father's sister, while my father and brother were at the crematorium. So that's the first page of Numerology. Um,
And it's really like a classic beginning to a short story because you're immediately thrust into this world and into a particular kind of voice and personality. Um, I actually wanted to ask you about, the voices that you alternate in your stories, this third person narrative and the first person one. Um, how do you decide to do that? Like, why is this story not told from the perspective, say, of the father or maybe the dead mother or something like that? What makes you choose the narrator of the story in this form?
um, That's an interesting question. I guess it's funny because in the past I haven't been conscious of those choices, but I have been thinking about it more recently. Um, because I read an article about, like, point of view in fiction, and what certain things can do in terms of giving us distance or keeping us really close. Um, and I think for me, the first person was just what came most naturally. Like, when I start a story, I don't really know what the story is about. I think it starts with that voice in my head. So the first lines almost just come to me, and then uh, that's probably where, like, the point of view gets decided.
Right. Is this also a function of being, educated in the language of film? Because narratology in film also works in a sort of similar way.
Like, where we're very close to the
Yes, I
character
mean,
who's, like, central
the
to the
shifting
story.
perspectives of the characters. Like, how much of the film training that you had as a writer comes into this kind of narrative? That's what I wanted to ask you.
Um, I think it it helps in that in my head I can kind of see the scene to some extent. So, like, as a film student, I've been trained in how to block a scene, or how to direct your actors. So that's, I think, been a huge influence in that I always need to know, like, where is this character in space, how are they relating to the people around them, what does it look like in space, and maybe that also helps in that the first person is like they are the camera of the story, like,
Right,
it's
right.
their eyes. um,
There is
and
a camera-like quality to your scene.
um,
A lot of stories seem like they're sort of, you're looking at it through a camera, as it were. So I can completely get that. While we continue speaking, I just want to tell our listeners that they're free to send questions and comments on the channel, and we'll take them up as and when we come to the question answer sessions. Um, so, Anushka, I just wanted to understand, like, you won the Commonwealth Prize twice, and that must have been a big breakthrough moment for you. Like, what was the sort of, like, what were the turning points in your career as a writer, you would say?
um, that's interesting to think about, because a lot of times, you'd imagine that something is like a, moment of kind of success or a turning point, but actually the journey just starts over every few years. So it's a constant struggle in that sense. And, like, I won the prize in 2012, and after that, of course, there was, like, some sense of anxiety that, okay, I wrote one good story, like, what if nothing else I write ever lives up to that? So in some ways it was almost like holding myself to a higher standard to make sure that I can write something equally good again. But it definitely, just personally, it helped me to know that someone might actually want to read what I'm writing. So um,
Right.
that kind of kept me going.
And also, do you think your training as a creative writer in a kind of formal institutional setup, how helpful is that? Because there's always this, question among readers and writers both. to what extent does a creative writing course actually add to your, paraphernalia as a writer?
Yeah. I think partly it can depend on the kind of writer you are. So, because for me, my writing can get pretty messy. It helps to have like someone who's reading it and kind of helping me see what I've done almost to say, like, these are the threads that are working better, or this is where, like, Radio Story in the first draft had like three voices that I had just kind of patched together. And it was, I mean, I was very young and like very messy in terms of my writing at that time. So it basically just helped to have someone say, like, this voice is really exciting, but you need to kind of, make some parts of it coherent.
Right. But Radio Story is actually, I mean, for readers who haven't read it, I mean, it's one of the most ambitious stories because of its, not only of its narrative technique, but also the scope of the story, in the fact of its being embedded in a kind of historical context that you go back and forth and all of that. And I see this sort of recurrence of history in your stories, especially the colonial period. And where does that come from?
um, Oh, I haven't thought of this before. So, um, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I don't know if it's like history particularly as much as I am slightly obsessed with just like how we remember things or our relationship to the past. And so I guess to some extent that has manifested in addressing those histories. Um,
Yeah, I think time is a very kind of crucial factor in your stories, and I was constantly trying to place the stories in a particular moment, and trying to understand where they're coming from. And partly because in spite of your stories being short stories, you also convey a certain sense of character development. One of my favorite stories is actually Feline, as I was telling you before this conversation. And apart from the usual, the structure of a short story, which usually packs in a shock at the end, kind of, anticlimax, it has this sense of a character evolving right in front of your eyes and in very quick sort of sequence, in like real time, as it were. How do you sort of do this thing, like this character sort of building in a short story?
um,
Especially now that you're writing a novel, where you have a bigger canvas, a much bigger kind of possibilities kind of before you.
so I'm really happy to hear you say that, because I've been having like genre envy when I read a novel, and I'm like, you know, this character really grows with you as you read. And like, I was reading Cersei, and I just felt this attachment to the character because it's over like 300, 400 pages, and the emotional moments later in a novel can really hit you harder because you've become attached to the character that you've been spending time with. And I do wonder if like a short story has that same power, just in terms of it being so compact. So I'm glad that it does. Um, but I think it that wasn't necessarily conscious. One of the things I do try to be conscious of in writing characters generally is to not make them too like to not make their intentions or motivations too apparent, because I feel like in life we don't know our own selves that well. So fictional characters should be true to how we feel about ourselves or other people in real life, in terms of unknowability.
There's always a second chance in fiction, and also I think less judgment involved in that sense. Like, you can actually, let your hair down metaphorically and do things which you won't do in real life.
Yeah.
Which is what I was very sort of intrigued by in Feline, and I'm not going to give out the plot because it's very crucial that we protect it. But it was that turning point in the story which kind of fascinated me, like how the tables were turned on the protagonist of the story. The other story that I really loved was Elephant Maximus, and again, like it had a very fantastical kind of character to it. And I wonder where this fantasy element comes from, because apart from the fact that a short story has to do a lot in a very short span, and probably that's why we introduce as much surprise as possible in that you know period of the prose, because we want to hold the reader. Where does this fantasy life come into your writing? These circuses, these animals, they keep coming back, as it were.
Um, so I've been thinking about like how my writing now is a lot different. And I think I maybe because I'm just older, I'm more comfortable with things that are kind of slower and maybe even like just less fantastical almost. And I think some of these stories were written when I was really young. And like I've heard it said that there are certain things we can only write at a certain age because our brain is just like in that space or working a certain way. And I think back then, I was like, I had a fear of boredom in my stories. Like maybe I just, didn't have the confidence or trust that a reader could get bored and still stick with the story. So there's definitely this element of like make the story more exciting, which now I'm more comfortable kind of being conscious about or playing with slowing things down, I think.
Right, right. And there's also this element of edge and risk taking in your fiction, I feel. Like characters do things which are almost like not kosher, as it were, like, they're sort of going to cross a line. Is that also a result of, avoiding boredom? Is that some kind of strategy to deal with real life?
Um, I think that is probably me thinking more along the lines of like, what would happen if this character did this, and then that kind of almost being the question that starts the story. I think that's where Feline began. It was like, what if this were to happen? Like, where would that take us? But that's almost an element of plot where you're like, what is the most, I don't know, transgressive thing this character could do?
So I'm going to come to the process of the writing, how it flows and all of that. But before that, would you like to read some sample from any of your stories, the other stories?
Yeah, I can, let me see. I can read from one of the stories we just talked about. So maybe um, I can read from the beginning of Feline.
Yeah,
Um,
that's lovely. I was just thinking of that.
uh, Typically, I would never take on a case like this, but I was feeling sympathetic because my cat had just died, and you know how death softens people. The cat's name was Boccaccio, and with no one else to take care of, I had a lot of free time. The woman who approached me was named Anna. She pronounced it like she was Russian, but she was from Michigan. She had moved to Texas for library school. I figured the job would be a good distraction from my sadness. Tail her ex boyfriend Jeff and find out whom he was dating and whether he loved her. I didn't want to get into it with Anna. Her eyes looked red and puffy, like she'd been crying a lot. But, like, who can say whether two people are actually in love or if it's just the dopamine pulsing through their bodies from all the fucking? I prefer cats to people because boundaries are simple with cats. They stick to their corners of the house and approach gently when they require their belly to be scratched. With clients, I like to imagine a glass wall in front of me, as though I'm a cashier at the bank.
I mean, this is really like a wonderful opening, and you can't stop reading after this. It's just like you want to go on reading. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking, how does this progression happen for you? Like from A to B to C to D. I remember, I read somewhere that Charles Dickens used to write his novels. Like he used to sit down to write and just write and develop as he went along. What is the, process of writing for you? Is there a plot in the beginning? Is there a thought of the end? How do you come to the end? When do you know that you've reached the end?
So I think it each story has had like a slightly different process in some ways, but most often it'll start with a voice in my head or just an idea like what if this character did this, and that's the starting point. With Feline, I think I also knew that I wanted to experiment with writing a detective story. So that was just kind of like a challenge I set myself. And then it was, from the beginning to the end, just kind of every day writing a chunk of it. And in that sense, it was pretty linear in that, like, the first line I write is the first line of the story. Um, but I think, and another thing that helps me, so when I'm writing a short story, I know the length I want it to be, like, because most of our short stories have to be around 3,000 to 5,000 words in length, mostly because of what, like, literary journals want. Um, so I have that endpoint in mind, and sometimes if I'm in the middle, I'll tell myself, okay, this is what I want the last scene to be. So how do I get from where I am to that point? And then I allow myself to kind of take whatever path I want to that endpoint.
Right, right. So again, one of the stories which I think is very well crafted is the first story, Drawing Lessons. And again, I felt that there was a gradual build up. And every time you thought you'd reached a climax, there was something more, something over the edge that was happening. Again, I was wondering when I was reading that, is that something that it struck you that maybe I shouldn't end it here, but I should like push it a little further? That idea of pushing things a little further, like how much of that sort of comes into play when you're writing?
Um, yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. I think, uh, yeah, maybe it actually comes from not plotting the story, because when you're plotting it, you know the shape. You're like, it'll go like that. So
Yeah.
there is a point at which you're at the most, conflict that'll happen. So I think that story in particular, I think of the narrative as an accumulation. So it's um, not really going in the bell curve shape. And then maybe
Yeah.
that gives a sense to a reader of, like, where is it going to really go?
It's a kind of gradual build up, and like I felt that it was like an accretion of things, accretion of emotions rather, like gradually leading to the end. And again, like I wonder, so one of the things that I wanted to ask you obviously is, who are the short story writers that you grew up reading? Where does this sort of idea of writing short story come to you? um, Whether they're sort of writers writing in English or other languages. If you would talk about that a little.
Yeah, so this actually struck me after I read your review of my book, which I loved. I think everyone loved that review. Like, it's my favorite. But you mentioned, like, this American tradition of Raymond Carver and Gertrude Stein, and it made me realize that, not consciously, but just because I was in writing workshops in America, all of the writers I was being taught were in this kind of American tradition. Like, I think 5 out of 7 writing teachers will end up teaching a Raymond Carver story.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of those short story writers that are, classics um, in that world, which I ended up studying just by nature of being in that space. And I think, like, Lydia Davis is still a favorite. So I think, like, her stories are entirely voice driven. Like, there's nothing happening. It's just like really going into the mind of this character who's maybe just like slicing a piece of fish or something. And I don't know why I love those stories that much. Like, I can't describe it to another person unless they read it. And I think what with her, it's more about, like, the sentence level tension. Like, she's doing something with her sentences that's really interesting. Um, and like, I don't know if it comes across that way, but for me, my writing is very much at a sentence level. Like, that's where my focus is, and then that kind of accumulates into a story. Like,
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Lydia Davis because I'm also obsessed with her books, and I keep reading her. And it's like trying to understand puzzles, as it were, when you read her stories. You just want to figure out, like, what does this 3-line thing mean? Like, Why is it a story and not just three sentences? And that to me is a great gift. Like, we may not be able to fathom the meaning of everything all at once, but to be able to return to a literary product in that way, time and again, and trying to understand it, trying to, make sense of it is a big thing. And in your stories too, I find that there is no anxiety of actually giving a very neat ending or even a kind of neat meaning to the story. Sometimes it's just, a sort of cluster of emotions. Uh, Again, it's a very American evolved form of short story writing and reading. Did it worry you that it might be, misunderstood in other parts of the world? Because it is a very specifically American tradition, I feel.
That's interesting. I guess I wasn't worried because I was, writing with my immediate environment in mind. Like, okay, how is this story going to do in class when I submit it to these 12 people? Uh,
Right.
like, I didn't expect all of those stories to come out as a book. So maybe now over the next few years, how that changes my approach to what I write will be interesting. But yeah, there is like definitely sometimes I want to like respond to a comment that someone has made online and be like, I understand why you didn't like this story, but doesn't mean it's a bad story. So I get that. Like, even, I mean, it, like in class when we're reading someone like Lydia Davis, 50% of the class will be like, this is really boring. I don't understand like why I'm reading this. So with every writer, I think it's you have to kind of try to meet it on its own terms and see what it's trying to do, and then whether it has done that.
Right, right. I think we're also living in a culture where we are very quickly bored with boredom. We don't actually take boredom for what it is and try to understand, what it
Yeah.
is really. Why is it boring and what is it trying to say, basically.
Yeah.
Uh, I actually wanted to know, like, when you were say workshopping a story with your American classmates, and in that context, did you feel that you had to write about India in a certain way? Was that pressure ever there at the back of your mind?
Um, yeah, it's still sometimes there. So like Feline in the collection is the only story that's not based in India. And that was, again, I told myself like I want to write one story that's based in Texas because I lived there for like 5 years. But I think more than pressure, it also for me at that point was the world I was most comfortable kind of using as the space for my stories. So it wasn't in a negative way. It also like you have that distance from a place, and that helps you almost helps you write about it better. To like be on another continent and then write about this place that's in your head now.
Right. It also makes you braver, I suppose, because I don't know when you wrote the story about the circus, for instance, but it is a very sort of brave leap into something I presume is sort of unknown to you relatively. Then, like probably you just sort of work with the imagination. And it gives you a kind of courage as well, I suppose, to leap into the unknown.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's much more freeing to like have distance from something and to make it up. I think that's why I find nonfiction just like impossible because you have to. There's a lot more clarity required. Like there's a real world referent that you have to almost be true to. Um,
Yeah, yeah. You have to be sort of, a realist writer in many senses. Um, Coming to that, actually, some of your characters are quite sort of almost genderless or gender fluid, I feel. And in Feline, for instance, for a long time, I didn't know whether the detective was male or female. And there was this sort of little fog in my mind. It could be both, or it could be someone, very sort of unpredictable and unplaceable. I feel that there is that tension in your stories, and the desire to sort of place people squarely in a milieu is not always obvious. Is that something that you think about? Is that something that you've kind of thought about earlier?
Yeah, that's interesting because I definitely knew the gender while writing feline, and I hadn't expected someone to be confused while reading it, but it makes sense now. Um, but with the earlier stories, I hadn't thought about it, but it was almost like the stories led me to my interest in, thinking about gender, and that led me to do my master's in gender studies, where like I think some of my stories have that influence of, having read a lot of theory, which is again something that I'm now like ambivalent about, because it can make some stories a little inaccessible maybe, so, if you're not reading the same books or kind of immersed in that world of theory sometimes. But so one of the ideas I encountered, which really changed my thinking around this, had to do with the idea that like asking someone to define their queerness, or asking them to say like, are you straight or not, is almost a can be a form of homophobia, because it's how straight people maintain their boundaries. They say like, this is gay, this is not gay, and that's how we'll be comfortable with our like cisgenderness or straightness. And so that's still something I think about, because people always want to know like, what is this character like, or this person, and so I like the idea of not defining that for someone.
It's very interesting that you say that, because some of the characters, even in drawing lessons, I'm tempted to ask the protagonist, who are you? And then she kind of reveals herself, like unpeels herself gradually, and at the end you just feel you've encountered somebody you hadn't quite expected, that this is the person. And there's that sense of peeling off the mask. I mean, it sounds very literary when I put it this way, but there is that real sense of discovery of a character, and you have to be patient, and you have to forbear with them slightly to actually sort of get to who they are. I felt that very kind of tangibly with some of the characters, I must say.
But it's been really nice to see how things have almost changed in how people approach such texts, because early on, like maybe around the time that drawing lessons came out and before that, I would get people asking me things like, why is it important for you to write about homosexuality? And like, I wouldn't respond to that. It's quite bizarre. But now I think things are starting to change. So people are like much more sensitive and generous in their readings.
Yeah. And also beyond the homosexual, heterosexual, like the binary spectrum, as it were. I mean, your characters are very questioning and curious, and they are sort of, fallible, and they can do things which are quite unpredictable. Like you might form an opinion of them in the beginning, and then in the midway, somewhere they don't meet you, as it were. Like they just show a different color, and which I find hugely comforting, because if everything was so predictable, and if homosexuality, bisexuality, all these were such set in stone principles, then there is no fun in writing about these things. And I think that your stories kind of do this very well, this sense of suspension and tension that you create with characters.
That's really nice to hear.
So, I mean, I could just go on talking, but I'd also urge people to send questions. We have some questions coming in. I can see one. But actually, let's take the question. Maybe we can do a reading at the end. So Taksha is saying that I love Principles of Prediction. It's sparse prose with elements of magic realism worked for me. Right. I wanted to know whether this magic realist feel was a conscious choice. We sort of discussed a bit of the fantasy aspect of your stories, but if you would like to add something about magic realism.
Yeah, that is interesting. So definitely early on, I enjoyed having that kind of fantastical element to the stories, and sometimes it maybe helps with you know uh, disorienting the reader, or telling something in a new way almost, or maybe even putting across an uncomfortable emotion in a way that's more um, approachable for a reader when it's in this slightly fantastical context. But it's definitely a question I've started asking myself more now, and it's an important kind of question of form. Whenever you write something, is it like, is this fantastical element actually adding to the story, or is it just kind of decorative? So that is something I think about still.
Right, right. So questioning the need of this device, basically.
Yeah, what it's doing.
Yeah, rather than just writing a story with the preconception that you're going to write a magic realist story. So while we wait for other questions, I actually wanted to ask you, since you mentioned Lydia Davis, we all know that she's greatly fond of notebooks and note taking. Like, she carries around a pen and notebook everywhere. Is that something that appeals to you? Is that something that you do too?
Yeah, so I have kept a diary for like, I don't know, a decade now, kind of obsessively. So I have like stacks of them. But yeah, I don't know how useful they are as like, for my stories. But I think what it does is just to get you into the practice of translating everything into language almost.
Right.
But I know Lydia Davis, like, she almost turns her notebooks into her short stories as that kind of playfulness
She
of.
does, and what one learns from her, I think, is the art of observation. Like close observation, and not only observing the surface of things, but also trying to see beyond the surface and imagining what the rest of it is. And that, I think, is kind of the interface between fiction and fact that she beautifully sort of recreates in her work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, now I feel like now I know how to try to explain to people like why she's so amazing.
So I'm going to just ask you one last question, and then we can probably do a short reading. And if there are no more questions, we'll end the session. But this is actually pertaining to the films that you like, because filmmakers, rather, directors that you are fond of, because so many of your stories are so cinematic. Like even the ones which are vignettes, there are very powerful visual kind of vignettes, as it were. So I was wondering if this comes from a tradition of having academically sort of trained yourself as a film writer, film student, and from where?
Um, that's interesting. I mean, now that you mention it, so one of my favorite filmmakers is Wong Kar-wai, and I can, when I think about him, I can see how some of what you've described in terms of this kind of plotless mood board kind of thing is something that his movies also do, where you kind of just follow a character along their path. And like Chunking Express is broken into two parts, but just to kind of give you different perspectives. So there's also kind of fragmentation happening. Um, so yeah, I think there is something there. Like I've uh, I've definitely had to edit my own, short films as part of my training. And I know a lot of people compare like film editing to the process of writing in terms of like how do these pieces go together, or like,
Hmm.
uh, what is the uh, way that they are working next to each other even.
Especially like what flows into what, like that kind of sequencing is very kind of driven by film editing, I feel. And I mean, to me, actually, Agnes Varda is one person I remember when I read your stories, because she also does this strange thing of documentary realism and then throwing in like bizarre, magic realist kind of moments, supernatural moments. So her movies are neither fictional nor quite, real in that sense. And I like that in betweenness that she creates, that world. So I just thought that I would add that. Um, so I don't know if there are any other questions. Maybe we could do a short reading before we end this session.
Yes, sure. Okay. Let's see which one. Um, I can read maybe from the first section of Radio Story. I don't usually read this one. So, um,
Yeah, that will be lovely.
Bombay, 1939. My wife is happiest on Sunday afternoons when I leave the house. We have been married 5 years. too soon for us to take pleasure in each other's absence. The boys I spend time with at the Irani cafe do not share this sentiment. They believe love and marriage are separate institutions. Rustam, my best friend, is unmarried. His opinion does not count in these matters. Idalji is older than the rest of us, but his views are biased since he is trying to find a suitable husband for his 19-year-old. Jiev, the fourth member of our amateur radio club, will go to great lengths to get away from his wife. He is not a licensed radio operator like the rest of us, but he always brings a flask of Black Label to our weekly meetings. The boys call me LK because my radio call sign is VU2LK. After lunch, we go home and converse only in Morse code on a frequency no one else has access to. We have voice capable radio transmitters, of course, but this feels more intimate, our own private language. So,
This sounds like a science fiction fantasy, but it's not. It's very much grounded in history and real life. I mean, these are really beautiful teasers, and I would all urge you to buy the book from Champaka. It's available online. You can order it, or if you're in Bangalore, go to their beautiful physical bookstore and buy it from there. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Anushka, for this conversation, and I wish you all the best. Can't wait for your novel to come out. So, and thank you, Westland and Champaka Bookstore, for hosting this. So see you soon again.
thank you so much.
Thank you.